I don't know how many people have actually heard my comments before. Uh, it goes back, it's more than 65 years for me. That's how long I've been in this trade, in this business, as a researcher, as a lecturer in nutritional science. And I would like to start off by saying, there's a tremendous amount of information. It's really quite confusing for a lot of people, especially those not trained in science. And what I would like to do is not to focus so much on those details, but to sort of take a 30,000-foot level examination of some of this information. And I'm going to pull up my screen, and I hope we can see it here shortly. It was working. It says I am sharing the screen, but I'm not on it. I don't see it myself.
Yes, so it looks like you are sharing your screen, and you just need to select which slide you want to get started with, Colin.
Okay, there.
Yep.
Unfortunately, buried behind some other things.
Okay.
Okay, so in any case, this story is, as I say, really quite complex. It's generated a lot of enthusiasm here in the last 10, 15, 20 years or so. And we call it the plant-based movement, if you will, or it's really focused on the use of plants as a means of gaining health, eating plants, if you will. But it is, for me at least, it's really a question about nutrition, the concept of nutrition. Unfortunately, nutrition is spoken of oftentimes by a lot of people around the world, but quite frankly, we don't talk about it really as if it's really very well known. It's really quite confusing for a lot of people. And I would like to start first off, just sort of characterizing nutrition in reference to a couple other words that oftentimes gets confused with it, namely diet and food. We all know what a diet is. It's an array of foods that we routinely consume. Food, obviously we know what all that is. I want to focus on, and sometimes I should say these words are used, unfortunately, interchangeably, but I want to speak specifically about the nutrition and the evidence for nutrition in order to understand how food works and what kind of diets we should use. Nutrition basically is, we can't get an expression here going here. Nutrition is the biological expression of foods. It's really what happens after we consume the food and how it operates with our bodies. And really, obviously, it's operating in a physiological and biochemical sense. And it's from that body of data that I really for the most part, gained a lot of the information that I ended up having. And here's a statement here, a bit provocative to say the least, but I really believe this, namely that the nutrition of a whole plant-based diet or plant-based foods does more overall to treat disease and restore health than all the pills and procedures combined. I know there's a mouthful, no pun intended, but it is really quite a striking effect that is not well known in the public. Yet on the other hand, as far as human health is concerned, nowhere is this information so misunderstood as that for nutrition. Now, I had to go back a few years in my own career because this is germane to what I ended up talking about, which is quite the opposite of what I started out with. Namely, I came from a dairy farm. And at that time, milking cows, obviously, for the good protein that the milk had. And then eventually I was in graduate school at Cornell University doing a doctoral dissertation that was designed to actually promote the consumption of more animal protein, very commonly accepted idea. And then finally, when I had my first faculty position at the Virginia Tech University in the 1960s, I was given responsibility for overseeing or coordinating, if you will, a State Department project that we had at the university for developing a model for feeding malnourished children in the Philippines. That was a problem around the world, as we probably all know. Many of you probably know that. And the idea was that we should try to figure out a way for them to get more protein. So the reason for showing you these three quick pictures here is that for me, it was protein, protein, protein. The more, the better. I mean, we didn't have to think about it. Everybody just knew it. You know, the more protein we could get, the better off we're all going to be. And then during the course of that work in the Philippines, I happened to see something that was rather peculiar for me. Namely, I saw I got the impression, especially from my medical colleagues, that the youngest of the children were getting liver cancer. That was really odd because that was another hat I was wearing at the time, having to do with cancer. And the idea that young children would get liver cancer was unheard of, because that's a kind of a disease that tends to occur in middle to older age people. In any case, that was the idea, that the youngest children who were most likely to get the liver cancer were from families that were consuming the better food. They were not very common, but nonetheless, the ones consuming the most protein, especially animal-based foods like we do in the West, they were the families that had the children that seemed to be more susceptible to the cancer. Then this particular research paper here appeared at the time, in the 1960s, from India. It's a study with experimental animals where the researchers had in mind that if the cancer started to, it was actually begun by a chemical carcinogen, if you will. It was begun and then fed 2 different levels of protein. The higher levels of protein, the 20% of total calories, should be protective. I mean, that was how much protein was revered. Higher protein intake should protect against the formation of cancer. As you can see there, it's exactly the opposite. That was pretty startling. So with my impression from the children, together with this study coming from India, clearly there was a question here. It seemed to indicate that increasing protein might have something to do with increasing cancer. Really unheard, very provocative idea, hard to believe. So I came back to my university, my laboratory, and at the time, and decided to do some research. I really had to. I mean, do we promote protein consumption of these young children, especially from an animal-based source, while at the same time having this kind of information? So I got a grant from the National Institutes of Health that actually, for this particular grant, kept getting renewed and lasted for 27 years. And during the course of those 27 years, I learned a lot, not just about the question concerning the relationship between protein and cancer in this particular case, but a lot of other things that were rather fundamental to the way we think about nutrition as the way we think about cancer and other diseases. I'll show you just a couple of little graphs here, of the more provocative kinds of things we saw. This is a chart here showing that over the first 12 weeks of development of cancer in experimental animals, animals that actually start with a mutated gene that gives rise to liver cancer, then fed 2 different levels of protein. Here's what happened. The animals fed the higher levels, like the Indian workers, the cancer grew well. The animals fed the lower levels, 5% of it did not. So here was almost confirmation of what I thought I was seeing amongst the children, and certainly a confirmation of what the Indian workers had done. Higher protein, higher cancer. So then we did a whole variety of different kinds of studies over the years, published this work extensively. And here's one that really caught my attention first off, that really was about provocative squared, if you will. I wanted to know the extent to which, if we changed the diet during the course of those 12 weeks, if that would have some effect on cancer development. And as you can see here, feeding the animals 20% of protein, that's 20% of total calories in the diet. Feeding a diet 20% protein in the first 3 weeks, the cancers are growing. You're rolling that dotted line, if you will. We switched the diet to 5%, we turned it off, back to 20, and back to 5. This demonstrates something really kind of startling. It was really hard to believe, because it turned out that this just adjusting the level of protein in the diet of these animals actually controlled the extent to which the cancers eventually formed. These are early cancers, by the way. At the time, I took that to represent the total cancers, and we did that study a few years later, and indeed it does. But I just want to show you the way we learned some of this information here. So, here's one of the things that suggested, namely that nutrition, rather than genes, primarily controlled cancer development. It was popular in those days. It still is today, probably even more so to some extent. People tend to think that cancer is a product of our genes, when in reality, what we are seeing here in this particular model was that the amount of protein in the form of a kind of nutrition was actually controlling cancer development. So we did that in different ways and got more or less the same results. The next question really had to do with, well, how does it work? When we in science see something so provocative as this, the idea is not going to last very long until we learn something about what is the so-called mechanism by which it is caused. I'm showing you here a duplicate or representation of a slide. This is representing the course of cancer development schematically over the course of time. There are 3 stages for cancer. A first stage called initiation. That's when a cancer first starts from a mutation. That's the damaged gene, if you will. The second stage is much longer. That's the stage during which those cancer cells, once formed, initiated, if you will, that's when they divide to grow into eventually into tumors, and then finally they metastasize and they cause cancer. All I want to show you here is something that was really pretty astounding. We were looking for the explanation of how this high protein diet turned on cancer. And so we first looked at the first stage, initiation. We looked for a bunch of different mechanisms. By the way, this took about 12, 13, 14 years or so with a lot of graduate students I had who were doing their doctoral dissertations on this research. And as we looked for the mechanism, I was assuming at the time there was some particular mechanism that would account for this. So we looked for some mechanisms. And this is just a list of them here. I can't go into the details of them, but in any case, the high protein diet, I'll just mention the first one, increased the amount of the carcinogen that got into the cell when the animals fed high protein diets. And then after that, when the carcinogen gets into the cell, the high protein diet changed the enzyme that's responsible for activating the carcinogen to actually bind to the DNA, which is gene, the functional part of the genes. And then this latter has to do with the body's ability to repair that damage. In any case, we look for a bunch of mechanisms here with the thought in mind that if we could identify the mechanism, maybe then we could develop a drug, to stop this process if it turned out to be a real life event. So we found a bunch of mechanisms here in the first stage, and then we go down below, as you can see. It turned out that when we started looking for a mechanism in the second stage, we saw the same thing, a bunch of mechanisms. I finally got to a point, and I say one of these mechanisms, by the way, was a lot of research, and it really it involved essentially a doctoral dissertation on the part of the students who were doing this. So I'm only showing you the very, very tip of the idea. But it turned out after some years, I didn't think we were going to find a mechanism. In fact, a thought occurred to me that there wasn't one mechanism that accounted for this effect. There's a whole bunch all working together. It was really quite astounding. In fact, during this period of time, I counted up 10 mechanisms that were possible candidates to explain the protein effect. But in any case, among those 10 mechanisms, 8 of them were increased, 2 were decreased, and it turned out of the 8 mechanisms that were increased, that would lead to cancer. Of the 2 mechanisms that were decreased, that would lead to cancer also, because those are good mechanisms to essentially protect us. So in effect, I all of a sudden realized we had looked at 10 mechanisms. I could list another couple here. And every time we look for a mechanism, they always showed the same thing, even though those mechanisms were distinctly different. So it led to this idea. Nutrition, in this case protein, doesn't operate by a single event to cause a single effect. What's really happening, they're all working together in a marvelous kind of way. And I'm going to return to this thought a little bit later on. So to quickly summarize what we learned here, nutritional control of cancer development involves not one, but multiple mechanisms. And I should say, I'm going to extend this as we go through the lecture. This is a property of nutrition in general, not just protein, not just the cancer, but it also other kinds of diseases as well. So when something is acting in the body like a nutrient, it is very likely to be causing a variety of changes that occur. And interestingly, those changes that occur all tend to feed to the same endpoint. This in turn questions, in a broader context, they began to question for me, and over the years, I feel very comfortable saying this statement, that nutritional control of disease, whereby each nutrient is operating by a whole collection of kind of mechanisms all working together to produce the result, that questions are the premise for our use of drugs to solve problems. Drugs are being invented and used to target a particular event. That's really fundamental to the entire pharmaceutical industry. So I'm suggesting in this case that here's a case where nutrition stands in opposition almost to the use of drugs in terms of controlling disease. Nutrition, when reading whole food, all these things are working together to do whatever they're going to be doing, as opposed to drugs, which is premised on the assumption that we could find maybe a single mechanism to do this. I'm sorry, this thing keeps bounding around on me. I don't understand what's going on. It just escaped me. I don't know what's happened here. Still says I'm sharing.
Yes, you're still sharing. What's the problem, Dr. Campbell?
Yeah, can you see it? I can't see it.
Yeah, we can see your screen. It is dimmed a bit now.
I don't know where it went to.
Do you have any other tabs open?
Let me control some of these here. This is embarrassing. I don't know what happened to it.
Did the screen time out or did your screensaver pop on?
Okay, I got it back.
Like it's back. Okay.
So in any case, that was the thought I just left with you, that nutrition operates in a very different way from drugs in terms of its ability to control disease. Nutrition, as I say, operates in a very comprehensive way. A lot of things work at the same time. So with those two thoughts in mind, then I also was interested in another question, namely the protein that we were using to turn on the cancer was casein. Now, casein is the main protein of cow's milk. And that's why I mentioned to you my own personal background coming from a dairy farm. I mean, this is hard to imagine. Of all the proteins that we know of, and there's many, many proteins from all kinds of animal foods, casein and egg protein are two of the so-called highest quality ones. And here we have casein of cow's milk turning on the cancer. So I was interested in knowing whether or not a couple of plant proteins might do the same thing. And I'm just summarizing here for you the results. Namely, we tried soy protein, we tried wheat protein, and by inference, there were some other plant proteins too. It turned out soy protein and wheat protein did not increase this cancer development in those early stages, even when they're fed at higher levels. So we have another very exciting, provocative idea. The animal proteins tended to turn on cancer. The plant proteins did not, even when they're fed at the higher levels. And I'm going to jump ahead here and suggest too that the same kind of thing applies to a variety of different other disease conditions. Now, having sort of come into this world of questioning basically, what protein can do, not what we think it can do, but what it really does. I have something blocking my screen here. I'm sorry about this. There's not, okay, get out of there. Um, so in any case, as I went through the years, I became more and more fascinated with the idea of, how is it that we have such a reverence for protein, especially animal-based protein, that at the same time, we're starting to see things like this and many other things I could show as well. So I finally got around to, in the late 1980s, to have an opportunity to look at the history of this field, to see if I could understand, where did this so-called reverence for that particular nutrient come about. And I want to show you just a short clip of 3 or 4 slides here to sort of indicate to you something that I think is really quite exciting. Protein was originally discovered in 1839 by a Dutch chemist by the name of Gerhard Mulder. Actually, he was isolating from meat that was being fed to dogs at the time. If there was anything chemical in that meat that might actually keep these dogs alive, and he discovered a chemical, isolated it, and it was the first nutrient was isolated at the time, and they had to give it a name. And so he thought it was very important, obviously. He named it after the Greek word proteos, P-O-T-E-I-O-S, whose literal meaning is of prime importance. He figured, and his colleagues agreed, that he had discovered something that was sort of like life itself, that this was the substance of meat that actually kept these animals alive. That's where the protein name comes from, is of prime importance from the Greek word. And so the question is, why did they think this is so important at that particular point in time in 1839? Well, it turns out if you go back still further, in the early part of the 1800s, and I'm skipping over a lot of other stuff that went on during that time, but here was an indication here of where some of this kind of thinking arose and what was done with it at the time. In the early 1800s, there was a doctor by the name of William Lamb, who worked at the Middlesex Hospital, one of the 2 key hospitals in London at the time, who got an interest in testing, let's say, a vegetable diet on his cancer patients. He himself had been living on a mostly animal-based food type diet until that time, until he was about 18, 19 years old. He had a difficulty. He switched to a plant-based diet and saw quite a lot of improvement. Then he became a doctor. Then he had patients, and cancer patients in particular. And so he wanted to know he wanted to be able to do some research on having his cancer patients try this so-called plant-based diet. He twice was rejected. He put a proposal together and twice was rejected by his colleagues. In any case, a later person actually indicated that he was warning against the dangers of excess food, particularly meat, as the substance, the basis for that. But in any case, his 2 proposals were turned down. I spent a year at the University of Oxford at the time, got those 2 proposals, dusted them off, and sure enough, he wrote this thing up and wanted to make this study, but his colleagues in that very well-known hospital turned him down. Then it came about that a younger person, in any case, I found that puzzling, the fact that he wanted to do this study on cancer patients. Ever since then, no one has really wanted to actually put that to the test. Not until just recently, when my youngest son, who actually co-authored a book with me, Tom, now on the faculty of a medical school, organized some research to actually study the effect of this whole food plant-based diet on breast cancer patients, stage 4 breast cancer patients, 200 years later. From that time onwards, from the early days, what it indicated to me was that there was some feeling about the idea that this protein was so valuable, the stuff of life itself, if you will, that we should not be tampering with it. We could not assume that it might actually be causing cancer. Then a younger gentleman came along after Mulder, and shortly after 1839, he became a very famous scientist. He's the founder of organic chemistry, actually, and the agricultural chemistry field, or the chemistry of fertilizer. And he was probably one of the most productive scientists in those years of anyone. He called this protein thing the stuff of life itself, the stuff of life itself. So enamored was he the idea that this substance that had been isolated, had something to really do really important. Then a little bit later, there was a German professor called von Voigt, who is often considered the father of dietetics. He had lots of students. He did some work. He got caught up in this protein thing too, and he was actually the mentor of many prominent nutritional researchers that lived on into the 1900s, in the middle of 1900s, if you will. And they really got caught up in the idea too that protein, of all the nutrients there might be, and there weren't many known in the early days, of course, that this was really the substance of almost life itself. He found, for example, in working with some patients, that he wanted to know how much protein is really required for good health. He established 52 grams a day. That was enough. And it turns out in the modern day, he was really overestimating it. It's probably more in the neighborhood of 25 to 30, 35 grams. But in any case, he had come up with a figure of 52 grams. But he was so carried away with this idea of the importance of protein, he ended up recommending 118 grams a day, because according to one of his students, Max Schurman, who himself was a fairly famous nutritionist, he referred to as protein interchange, the stuff of civilization itself. So in reality, my point I want to make here is that from the time protein was first discovered and then subsequently used by various scientists that followed thereafter, they all had such a reverence for this. And the only thing that seemed to really interest them was to make sure that everybody got enough. The protein that they were generally always talking about was the substance in animal food, namely meat. And they weren't aware that at that time, in the early days at least, that plants had protein too. But when plant protein was finally discovered in the early 1900s, they spoke of it as having an inferior quality compared to animal protein. So animal protein really took on quite a distinctive meaning as the years went by. So after a lot of the research that I've been involved in over the years, I've ended up actually with two main recommendations. I know you hear all kinds of recommendations. There's a lot of confusion in the field and things like this, but I'm going to suggest there's two recommendations, and I'm going to state the first one here, namely that we can get all the protein we need, without going into the details, we can get all the protein we need from plant sources. We do not need to consume animal food to get protein. In fact, the protein from plant sources, together with the other kind of changes that occur in plant-based foods, that is actually what's associated with decreased disease. So eventually, years passed, and when I was involved in writing the jaundice study with my, as I say, my younger son, who's a physician now, who as I say, we're starting to do the work on the diet and cancer thing. When we were writing that study, I became really quite interested in all the work we had done to wonder whether or not any research had been conducted over the years, perhaps on other diseases. And what we found was that in the literature at that time, there was evidence, and this is the early 2000s, about 2002, 2003. At that time, there was evidence in the literature, surprisingly, for all these different diseases over the years that indicated that the diet that was higher in animal-based protein, these kind of diseases tended to be increased. So it led to this here sort of concept here that whole food, plant-based diet prevents, suspends, and cures all of these diseases. There's a variety of them here, as you can see, so-called chronic degenerative diseases like the heart disease, cardiovascular diseases, cancers, multiple sclerosis, kidney stones, and so forth. Some of them are more of the nuisance, troublesome category. But what it shows is that this dietary effect is very broad. The whole food plant-based nutritional effect is indeed broad. It's also rapid. We now know that when people have difficulty especially as these diseases begin to form, if they were to switch, and this has been done a number of times, if they switch to a whole food plant-based diet, the response is very rapid. Sometimes within a matter of a day or two or three. For example, people with a risk of heart disease, high cholesterol, if they switch to a whole food plant-based diet, they can see their cholesterol in their blood drop within 24 to 48 hours. It's really quite rapid. So this phenomenon, at first, is very broad. It involves a variety of different diseases. At the second time, it's really quite rapid. And if the dietary change is sustained, it basically can be used now to treat a number of these diseases. What I mean by that has now been shown, especially in heart disease and diabetes and chronic kidney disease, for example. This is published. It's been shown that people who already have these diseases have been diagnosed with these diseases. If they were to switch to a whole food plant-based diet, basically, they see benefits very, very quickly, essentially with no side effects, which is quite a contribution for nutrition. So much for the protein thing. I just want to emphasize that that's, of all the things that we can talk about, I think the one thing that really stands out is the fact that animal-based foods in the form of protein that's contained therein is problematic. Now, there's one more idea that I want to bring to your attention. If I can just sort of skip over, go through it pretty quickly. Namely, it has to do with when we talk about nutrition, what are we talking about? Are we talking about the consumption of the individual nutrients in the food, or are we talking about the food itself? And there's some evidence that has arisen in the last 40, 50 years that we really should be talking about the food, not necessarily the nutrients in the food. Here's a study, for example, that came up in the early 1980s, subsequently was finished in the early 1990s, on the question concerning the ability of plants containing beta carotene, that's the early vitamin A, plants, it was shown that people consuming more plant-based material with more beta carotene in the blood, they had a less risk, for smokers at least, they had a less risk of getting lung cancer. And I just want to just mention this quickly without going into details. So they, with that observation in mind, there was a study organized in the 1980s, some Finnish and American scientists. They organized a study to study 29,000 male smokers for what was to be an 8-year follow-up. And what they found is that those smokers who consumed more beta carotene in the food, there was a decrease in lung cancer risk and was significant. In contrast, when the beta carotene was taken out, suspected as being the main agent, when it was taken out and put into a supplement form, it actually increased cancer. That in turn, together with a number of studies now since that time, this, as I say, is early 1990s when this was reported, there's been a number of studies showing that whereas food can have a major effect, a plant-based food, for example, can have a major effect on disease formation or perhaps even its control, we can't fixate on single nutrients being responsible, because when we take the nutrients out of the food context and put them in pills, quite frankly, they either don't have an effect in most cases, or in fact, in some cases, it's been shown they may have the opposite effect. This leads to a broad statement that I'm interested in, namely, when we talk about nutrition, and whole plant-based foods, we should think of it as the whole foods, not the parts of the food. In other words, as nature really had provided, essentially. I call this concept holism. The alternative is the idea of talking about nutrients as single agents, and I call that reductionism. And that has played a major role in what we tend to get confused about in the modern day. We don't think of food as whole food, we think of the individual nutrients contained therein. Here's another way to sort of explain what I'm really talking about. Namely, this is a chart here just showing an infinite numbers of, let's say, reactions that go on inside of a cell. And this is only just a tiny, tiny, tiny tip of the iceberg. It's far greater than this. Um, we have learned over the years in biochemistry how all these reactions work, or look at one thing at a time, and so forth and so on. Now it's gotten to this point and far more complex than what I'm showing you here. You can't see the details, obviously, but metabolism is a collection of an enormous variety of reactions going on. And the drug approach to controlling disease designed to basically find a reaction here that might be responsible for the disease, maybe a single reaction. And if we think we find a single reaction, then develop a chemical to intercept that reaction if that's what our desire is, or to enhance it. So we develop a drug to alter that single reaction in the midst of this forest of reactions. That's called target drug effects, if you will. And that ends up being having multiple side effects. So traditionally in the pharmaceutical industry, we have come to depend on drugs to a great extent. And it turns out that drugs across the board, when they're used, they all have side effects. Most of these drugs are designed to be targeting to specific events in the cell or specific diseases, certainly, but they have targeted side effects. That is characteristic of the approach that we use when we're talking about pharmacology. In contrast, nutrition, as I indicated before, is a very different kind of effect. Nutrition, when we're consuming whole food, all there's nutrients in them, and they're almost unlimited in number, and the reactions that they perform and participate in are also unlimited. When we humans consume whole food and we let nature take over and use the food in a way in which it's been designed to be used, these reactions and all those nutrients tend to work together without side effects. And the breadth of effect that I referred to before across different diseases is to be expected, because cells in the body are all dealing with all kinds of disease possibilities. This concept of everything working together, as I say, I call it holism. I only showed you just one tiny little part of it. It's the inside of a cell, and there's 10 to 100 million cells in our body. We can't see them. So all of that's working together. It's an infinite complex, highly integrated, instantaneous kind of action. That's nutrition, which is quite opposed to what we tend to think of nutrition when we think of what one nutrient can do at a time. There's other systems in our body. Obviously, I just listed some here that all work together. The nerve system, the hormone system, the vascular system, immune system, they all tend to work together with what the metabolism is going on inside the cell. So what I'd like to draw your attention to here is that when we consume food, we've got an infinite number of substances we like to call nutrients for the most part. We got an infinite number of substances that tend to work together in really marvelous sorts of ways inside the cell and involving other systems of the body to actually create the response we get. That's the reason that nutrition as an effect is so different, is so opposing, so almost essentially opposite that which we would tend to see with a pharmacological approach. And I'm going to suggest this is the display of nature itself. Nutrition is just a feature of nature, quite frankly. And I wrote about this in much more extensive representation, of course, but in this book called Whole, that was published in 2013. And for those of you who may be interested, that turned out to be a New York Times bestseller. And what I've discovered over the years since, the China study has been very, very popular, but the book Whole is really catching hold in a lot of communities, especially ones that are more deeply into the science, the more philosophical construct. That whole concept is really a very important departure from the approach that we tend to use in the modern day. So that leads to a second recommendation. I said in my first recommendation, we should consume protein from plant sources, avoid the animal foods for our protein. The second thing I'm suggesting is use whole foods. And by whole foods, I'm not talking about an intact food. Obviously, we can chop it up, we can cook it, we can do this, and we can do that with it. When I speak of a whole food, I'm talking about consuming the food with all of its nutrients sort of still there, intact. However we may process it, produce it, or whatever we may do with it. And these two very simple ideas, just these two ideas, eat plant foods and try to stick with the whole foods. That means not taking the stuff out of there and adding back oil or sugar or salt, that sort of thing, but use the whole foods. Those two ideas alone, to me, they're the simplest way to express this enormous complexity. If we did that, and that's all we have to remember, learn how to cook them, try them, get used to them, and you do. You can get used to them very quickly, the body adjusts. That will actually capture, in my estimation, at least 90% or more of the achievable benefits in health that we may desire. It's a kind of an approach that is taking something very complex and reducing it down to something, if you will, extremely simply. And so here's a quick summary of that in my slides. Holistic nutrition is a representation of multiple nutrients working together through multiple mechanisms, creating multiple diseases, a whole spread of diseases, and achieving multiple health improvements, all the way from preventing various kinds of diseases, as well as promoting health. And that's what I call the whole food plant-based diet. A really simple message, acknowledging the fact that it's an enormously complex biochemistry that we don't need to be all that concerned about as for everyday people. Those in science, of course, we can find fascinating things to work on, but basically, this is the message, I think, for the public. Medicine is the opposite of that. Modern medicine is very reductionist in nature. We tend to focus on one disease, assume there's a single cause or maybe a collection of single causes. We tend to think of one mechanism. So therefore, once we identify what the mechanism might be, then we're inclined to want to make a chemical to intercept that mechanism or enhance it, whatever the case may be. So this is almost the opposition to what I call holistic nutrition. Targeted drugs, where side effects are common. Holistic nutrition, unfortunately, is not taught in reductionist medical schools. Many of you may know that there's not a single medical school in the United States, for example, that actually teaches nutrition. And people often wonder, why is that so? Doctors who are our chief people, sort of administering health, obviously for us, they're not taught nutrition. And there's a reason for it. There's a philosophical reason for it. Because modern Western medicine is focused on using a single drug to treat a single event involving oftentimes a single disease. That's the way it works. That fits in with the economic model within which we're living. One can sell it, get intellectual property protection for those ideas, and that's where you go. This is a pharmaceutical-based approach we're using. Nutrition is, of course, the antithesis of that. Nutrition is something that people can do for themselves. All they need to do is eat right, let everything work together, take advantage of what nature has provided for us, and get far better results. So I just want to make that contrast between reductionist medicine and holistic nutrition. There's something else that there's been at work here over the years, why we tend not to know nutrition, not professionally at least very well. We have, in the United States at least, we have a major research funding agency called the National Institutes of Health, NIH. They're the ones that funded most of my research through the years. There's 27 institutes, one for cancer, one for heart disease, one for this, one for that. There's not one institute that's dedicated to nutrition. So here's a topic, nutrition. Here's the topic is nutrition. We tend not to know it because it's something that people can use without relying on medicine, if you will. We don't have a research institution. We don't have a research institution that really dedicates its efforts to that. And this is why nutrition is not considered as a serious medical school, as a serious science in medical schools. The China study, which came out in 2005, then reprinted since. Now, as it was indicated by Lisa in the beginning, it's been translated to a number of different languages. Now it's close to 4 million copies, and with a couple of companion books that come along with it, it's probably closer to 5. So it's quite been an exciting proposition. I have a new book coming out as of yesterday. It's called The Future of Nutrition. The subtitle says, an insider's look at the science, why we keep getting it wrong, and how to start getting it right. And I written this book with my grandson, who is a graduate, fantastic writer, Nelson Tisla, of the University of North Carolina. But here I'm attempting to go back in history to recount for the reader what are the reasons, I think, why nutrition has become so confusing on the one hand, why and how on the other hand, how we can actually use it to actually achieve tremendous benefits that go really beyond just personal health itself. Just yesterday, I was alerted to the fact that Barnes and Noble has picked it out as the it was listed as the best health and wellness titles for the year 2020. It was the first one listed. So we're hoping to that'll get out there and create some issues too. Now I want to finish off, if I can here, talking about another facet of nutrition that's totally missing, and it's really costing us in the modern day. I showed this particular slide before, you'll recall. And all of these diseases here, the chronic degenerative diseases, sort of the more minor ones, mental diseases, physical diseases, and that sort of thing. But interestingly, although these are so-called degenerative diseases, and that's where from we get most of our information involved in nutrition, we don't have listed here any of the viral diseases. It's kind of interesting. It turns out in science and in medicine, we tend to rather think that among the viral diseases, and now we have many, there's more than 80 that have been characterized and officially identified by official numbers, all the way from polio to AIDS to common flus and colds to some other kinds of viral diseases. There's a whole variety of different viral diseases, but very little, if anything, has ever been published to show how we might control these viral diseases by nutrition, especially the kind of nutrition I'm talking about here. There's some of the viruses examples. And of course, I'm really leading up to what we now are experiencing, the COVID-19 virus. My question is this: is it possible that nutrition can be used to control the COVID-19 pandemic that we're now experiencing? Can it have anything to do with it at all? I suggest that it does. And in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of skip through here quickly. When this whole coronavirus started at the beginning of this year, I recalled that in our study in China that was done along the way back in the 1980s, where we collected an enormous amount of information working together with Chinese colleagues and also with our British colleagues at the University of Oxford, I recalled we had some data there on a viral disease. In fact, the viral disease that we were working with, one of the viral diseases that we were working with at the time, causes more deaths, has caused far more deaths than the current COVID-19 virus. It's a very serious virus. It's the one that causes primary liver cancer. In fact, it may be the most deadly virus in the world today, according to some estimates. It kills something like 680,000 people a year in the world. That's how serious it is. We did this study involving lots of organizations and other research institutions, and it involved in those days 83, 84, 65 adults, located in 130 villages. We collected information on a total of 367 diet and lifestyle factors. We were able to compare all of these against about 4 dozen different disease rates in China, rural China. Later, we did it, repeated again in 1989, included Taiwan and mainland China working together. And it's this body of data here I want to show you what we learned from it. This now involves close to 9,000 adults, 170 villages, the same counties in rural China as we did initially, plus another 8 and 32 villages in Taiwan. Excuse me. Now, to break this down and to schematically present it, so it's a little bit understandable, I hope. This is the model for the hepatitis B virus that causes liver cancer. And so I wanted to show you the results we got. And then suggest for your thinking, this applies to the coronavirus as well. Namely, here's the virus here, hepatitis B. We call it hepatitis B surface antigen, okay? It comes in, it lands in the human body. It finds a host, whether it's animal or human or whatever. When it comes in the body, now it's an active virus. It's there in the body in theory. without symptoms. Once it infects us, it has two pathways it may follow. Either it may do its dirty work, in this case, liver cancer. That's the symptom of this particular virus, among some other things, but primarily liver cancer. Or it can be inactivated through the formation of an immune reaction to give rise to antibodies. So here's the virus landing in the human tissue. There at that point in time, going one or two ways, either forming a liver cancer or being inactivated, which it doesn't form cancer, okay? It turns out that then we were able to ask this question, and this work incidentally done over 30 years ago. We asked the question, is there anything about nutrition that might favor or impede, let's say, the development of immunity? That's the question. Well, it turned out we had access to a lot of nutritional factors. We collected blood samples, we collected urine samples, we did dietary surveys, we went into the homes of these people and measured exactly what they ate over 3 days. It was a mammoth study at the time. We collected, I'd say, a lot of nutritional characteristics as part of this. So I'm suggesting here what we had, the opportunity we had an opportunity to see what kind of nutritional factors, let's say, might favor the formation of antibody as the kind of nutritional factors that might cause liver cancer. Okay, let's have a look and see what we see. And this, as I said, came from the repeat of that study that involved Taiwan in the late 1989. And I'm going to just schematically, I hope I don't lose you here, but I want to just schematically show you the sort of the highlights of the research that we ended up with. Here's the antigen active virus that I mentioned before. Here's the little scheme I showed you up in the upper left-hand corner. But in any case, here's the antigen, the live virus. It can form antibody. It turned out those people consuming more plant food, they had a much higher prevalence of forming antibody. Consuming plant foods got rid of this virus essentially to form antibody. And that was indicated by a number of different ways of doing this. We looked at different kinds of factors. All of these factors here I'm listing for you are, I'm sorry, I got a blockage here. It's covered up my slides. All of these factors are plant-based factors, as you can see. You'll see little stars on them. And the stars indicate the degree of statistical significance. What I'm showing you here is that for, let's say, plant protein, the higher the level of plant protein consumption, or the higher the level of dietary fiber, thiamine, all plant substances, the lower the level of antigen. In other words, the active virus is less active in the case of those who consume plants. In contrast, those who consume plants, in this case fiber, protein, again, vegetables, highly, highly significant. Those consuming more vegetables, they have more antibodies. A distinct difference, and all of these are highly significant, extraordinarily significant. So here's a really a contrast. Those consuming more plants, more antibodies, and less antigen. So plant is favoring the inactivation of the virus. In contrast, those consuming more animal food in this population, they had a tendency to retain the antigen, the live virus, and decrease the formation of antibodies. Exactly the opposite from plant food, as you can see here. More plant food favored immunization. More animal food favored the active virus. And in fact, the antigen was highly correlated with liver cancer. The antigen that is favored by animal food. And it's significant, as I say, for those of you who have statistics, at the 0.001 level of probability. And the same here. People consuming more animal food, less antibodies, exactly the opposite. It seemed like to me, as far as the statistical analysis is concerned, nothing could be, I've not seen anything that's more striking and more clear than this. So animal food favors the activity of the virus, in this case, forming liver cancer. Plant food is favoring the formation of antibodies. Now, the first question people would like to ask, well, you're working with hepatitis B virus. This is not the coronavirus. What does that have to do with the coronavirus? Well, it turns out among all the viruses, here's a very generalized statement I'd like to make. We know lots of viruses. They've been around a long time. all the viruses come through one common system of ours when they infect us. They go through the immune system. The body, the job of the immune system is to inactivate viruses. Does a good job with a lot of them. That forms immunity. It uses different kinds of mechanisms. It's a very complex system, but all these viruses, they tend to have each virus tends to have a slightly different set of symptoms. Some cause cancer, some cause the respiratory problems typical of coronavirus, some cause AIDS, what have you, polio. So they all have different outcomes as far as symptoms are concerned, but they all have this in common. They all have that in common. This is what viruses do. So the question then becomes, what is affecting the immune system? Well, it turns out it's the plant foods. We consume plant foods that enhance the immune system to do what it does. So if I can take that model involving hepatitis virus, now apply it to, in this particular case, apply it to the COVID-19 basis. Here we have the COVID antigen, if you will. It lands on us, we test positive, no symptoms. Here now we're infected, this is infectivity here. It either can be inactivated through the formation of antibodies and a few other reactions here going on too, but it's commonly indicated by antibody formation. So we can maybe get immunized against it, or it's going to cause us symptoms. And what I'm suggesting is that the whole food plant-based diet, low in protein, low in animal-based food, and by the way, the study we did in China, the amount of protein being consumed there was only on average about 10% of what we do in the West. So what we were seeing here with these highly significant effects is even small intakes of animal food consumption had this effect of retaining the antigen and preventing the formation of antibodies. So it took a rather small amount of animal food to do this. So here schematically is what I'm trying to show here. If in fact, in this case here, people were consuming, exposed to the COVID-19 virus, consuming a whole food plant-based diet, or they switched to it, if you will, and actually rather quickly, they could form antibodies. In contrast, those who have, let's say, had a lifetime of not using this kind of diet, they already are well on the way of forming heart disease and cancer and diabetes and hypertension and so forth and so on. These are the older people. They're the ones that get into symptoms. So they're the ones are getting the symptoms. Ones that's actually contributing most to the number of deaths. These are people already been compromised by poor nutrition, basically nutrition that did not include the whole food plant-based diet. So the whole food plant-based diet is working in two ways. I would suggest one is it unfortunately has left these a number of people vulnerable. The comorbidity that we see with the coronavirus is an example of that. But at the same time, the whole food plant-based diet, I'm suggesting, works fast. From other evidence, works really fast. If people switch to it quickly when they're susceptible of being, let's say, contaminated or infected, if they switch to that, that's my bet, that's hypothesis, that it should work there as well. It can work within 1 to 5 days. I'm going to leave you with this thought here, and I just happen to have this just when I was putting this together today. It's a statement by a science journalist who's writing out of the Atlantic, apparently just in recent days. He's asking this question, the one that I've asked too. He says, COVID-19 could be a catalyst that fully reunifies the social biological sciences of medicine, bringing disciplines that have been separated for far too long. I really believe that we're now in a point in time when nutrition has to be recognized for what it is. Our professionals have to be trained in this area, and our definition of nutrition has to change. We have to recognize nutrition as a holistic science, whole food, whole plant-based food in particular, and that's in turn. Here's maybe an opportunity if we, with this particular coronavirus situation, if we can find a way to now catalog and characterize and study, if you will, in a reasonably formal way, what effect it would have on people who are being affected with the coronavirus, whether or not their nutrition could make a difference. I really think it would. So the alternative, what we're left is, and I don't want to belabor this point too much, it's a very sensitive matter at the present time. We've got some vaccines, obviously, that's turned up. They're much better in the short term than what we've ever seen before. So we can keep our fingers crossed, hoping that they might work. But nonetheless, on relying on vaccines and drugs, caring nothing about nutrition, we're spending lots and lots of money. Vaccines historically have had questionable efficacy over the long term, side effects and all that sort of stuff. And so we spend a lot of money taking this approach here, when in fact, one of the possible solutions is just deciding to eat the right kind of food. Now, I'll leave you with this for the last slide. We have an online program of plant-based nutrition working with Cornell. We've had this program for some time. For those of you who might be interested, you're welcome to give it a try. It's basically trying to capture what I've tried to describe here in the simplest possible terms. But in any case, I'm very enthusiastic for what nutrition can do. It's an area of science that has not been treated fairly. It has a long history of being mistreated, and now we know it has enormous capacity to be able to create health. And we can use it as individuals without relying necessarily on third-party intervention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Campbell, for that amazing presentation. I think one of the things that always still gets me excited is how quickly whole food plant-based nutrition works. We can spend years developing a disease or a condition, but really start to see that thing turn around when we change our diet. So thank you for reinforcing that fact. So let's get to questions here. I'm going to start with the questions that were pre-submitted via email. Then I see all of your wonderful questions coming in the chat here, and we'll get to those next. So the first question we have here, Dr. Campbell, is: you are proposing an ideal diet to have about 10% of proteins. Shall we eat all plant source or add some animal or egg sources?
No, ideally, I can only speak of ideally, but basically we need officially, we need 10% of total calories as protein. That's what's recommended. We actually need less than that, but that's been a number that we settled on for decades. All of that protein can be provided by plant-based foods. This is the point. All of that can be provided by plant-based foods. In fact, plants have as much as maybe 15, almost 20% legumes and that sort of thing, a lot of protein. That doesn't matter, because when we're consuming the protein in the form of plants, it doesn't have the same effect at all. So 10%, yes, and when we're consuming plant-based foods, even the plants that have the least amount of protein, potatoes, for example, they still have enough protein. So we don't need to ever think about protein again, not in reference to, turning to animal foods to get the protein. It doesn't serve no function as far as good health is concerned. So just eat plants, get all the protein we like.
Thank you. I concur. Question number 2, any current updated research on omega-3 and diabetes? Are you still recommending supplements from algae, or shall we stay only with our nuts and seeds?
I don't recommend supplements for anything, to be honest about it, not nutrient supplements. I have a little different take on that as far as, let's say, herbal supplements and that sort of thing, because that turns out to be, a lot of cases, dried food, if you will. But single nutrient supplements, I was deeply involved in that back in the 80s when that industry was started, because they were actually using a report that I was a co-author of at the time. And I was the one on the stand for 3 years at the Federal Trade Commission, passing judgment on the health claims being made. So I've been close to that industry. And whereas some nutrients in the short run kind of can fill up and look like they're doing us some good, in terms of increasing the amount in the body, in terms of their long-range use, they're not recommended. So we don't need, the only nutrient supplement that I think that where there is some evidence that would be useful to keep in mind is vitamin B12. B12 is something that we might pay some attention to. On omega-3s and omega-6s, yes, there's evidence showing omega-3s are associated with some bad things, not so good. Diabetes, for example. But the real question is not taking the omega-3s, once again, taken out of context and just administering the omega-3 or omega-6. We don't use omega-6s, but we shouldn't think of them that way. It's the ratio of the two. The ratio of the omega-6 to omega-3 should be around 4 or 5 to 1, ideally. We're up around 15 to 1, 20 to 1 right now with the Western diet. And so under those circumstances, if people take omega-3s, yeah, you might see in the short term a little bit of benefit, but the main thing is that's really a stopgap measure. Change the diet to get back to get the right ratio, balance of omega-3 and omega-6s.
Thank you. Next question, are there nutrition concepts that are readily agreed upon by those with science-based training in nutrition science fields? If so, what are those concepts?
The only concept that I know that's widely accepted is the one that we need protein, and we need animal protein. That's been a valued judgment for more than a century. I wish I had time to get through all that work, but that's about the only thing that's sort of a consensus. The only people who don't agree with that are obviously the vegans. And of course, with this new information, some of us now are understanding we don't need it. As far as our consensus on other things are concerned, I think there's a general consensus emerging that whole food is best. Processed foods, taking foods apart, putting in salt, sugar, and oil, and stuff like that. That's problematic. Most of us agree to that. Although we argue a lot about whether this much oil or this much salt, or this much sugar, should be used. My take on it is that those three things, salt, sugar, and oil, for example, they're addictive. They're addictive agents. And so we get used to them, and we want more and more and more as time passes. We get in trouble. So we don't need those. Just stick to the whole food.
Thank you. Okay, it's next question. You are able to rely on your credentials to impress upon people the importance of specific nutrition messaging. For those of us without letters after our name, can you give some thought to steps we can implement to make change?
Oh, wow. Well, the best thing to do is learn how to cook, for starters. Anybody could, and I think that's probably one of the major things right now that the average public can do. There's a lot of books out now that show how we can cook this kind of food. And what's amazing about this, and really good food, is very tasty. And we get used to it. We get rid of our addictions. And so, the letters that we have after our names, I know that can be abused. I have to say, speaking on behalf of my own community, I think that we in science have gone off the rails too much for too long of not addressing these issues for the public. We get caught up in the weeds where my colleagues are wonderful colleagues. That's not the issue. But the problem is when we start working with all these details in great detail, we run into a lot of confusing results, at least as far as the public is concerned. So I think the public has more of a responsibility than the scientists do. Without the letters, all they need to do is, learn how to cook the foods that they like. And it can be a variety of plant-based foods, keep a variety, but try to make a whole food and then see the results. And if they want to get a little more into it, do a study, let's say 10 days, 20 days, taking blood pressure measurements, maybe cholesterol before and after, and you can see for yourself. You can see for yourself. That doesn't take any degrees.
Thank you. Perlmutter ties brain diseases such as Alzheimer's to grains and legumes. What are your thoughts and/or opinions regarding this school of thought?
Well, I don't know that much about the brain diseases, although except that I know just more from anecdotal evidence in part, but a lot of it from people who are really seriously studying this, that this kind of diet actually has that kind of effect on our behavioral and mental and neurological state as well, involved in particularly our brain. I don't think we need to, unless there's specific evidence that people have of a particular agent that may have caused a problem. I I don't go in for these ideas where if people come up with these fancy solutions, letting everybody still do the wrong thing. So I don't support that kind of recommendation, actually.
Thank you. All right, I think you already touched a bit on this, Dr. Campbell, but with regard to vitamins, but specifically, is vitamin D still good to help with COVID immunity?
Vitamin D?
Yes, vitamin D.
No, it's all about sunshine in that case. We should be able to get enough of vitamin D. Again, it's a field that's been quite a lot distorted. We measure our vitamin D, let's say healthfulness, by measuring the storage form of the vitamin D. And we can store different amounts of vitamin D, that's the so-called 25 hydroxy. We can store different amounts of vitamin D to get the same results. Now we can get low on vitamin D. We can really get too low and have consequences. But quite frankly, again, vitamin D supplementation, for me, it's problematic. I don't see the need for that. Just get more exposure to the sunshine. Some people can't get exposure to sunshine. That's true. So maybe in that case, we suggest that they pay some attention to that.
Thank you. Next question, will you get the vaccine?
I know this is a loaded question. I'll just say it this way. I have never taken a vaccine for the flu. I've never taken a flu vaccine. And in this particular case, no, I don't intend to.
Thank you. How bad is sugar? Is a small amount okay?
Depends on what the sugar is. I mean, we have sugar, of course, in the fruit. We have sugar in the plants. That's where it comes from. That kind of sugar is fine in the whole food form, right? I don't see any problem with that. But the kind of sugar that I think people are asking about in this particular case is refined sugar. The stuff we have in the bowl and the table and so forth, or in cooking. We should minimize that. But at the same time, a little bit of sugar to get people to eat the good food. For example, we don't have any evidence that a little bit of sugar here and there is going to hurt the refined sugar.
As far as you know, are there animal products in the COVID vaccine itself?
No, I heard that, but I have no definite information on that whatsoever. So I don't believe there is. I just accept the reports of the authorities who claim it does not.
Thank you. What can we do to improve and support research about nutrition and health? Is there an effort to establish a nutrition institute at NIH that grassroots, I'm assuming, that we can support?
Yes, there's been some suggestions from time to time. I was one of the people. I wrote an op-ed piece in the San Francisco Chronicle about 10 years ago, advocating for developing a new nutrition institute. Some others have done the same thing. In fact, twice I was invited by 2 different administrations to come and give my thoughts on that, and I recommended it. But I come to find out that nutrition is not regarded by people in that kind of science as being a legitimate science. That's the problem. And the reason they don't want to accept it is because it's not focused, it's not reductionist. And so we have a real problem here on our hands, but there is some efforts going on right now, and I don't know. There's a congressman from Ohio, I think I forget his name, but there's some effort. I think it's gaining a little bit of traction. I wish that on that score, the thing that I would recommend as far as policy is concerned, the main thing we should do as citizens is to do all we can to get the Citizens United Supreme Court decision of 2010 overturned. Many people might not know that piece of legislation or that decision was a 5-4 decision in 2010. It enabled people with lots of money and corporations essentially to buy elections, to pour money into elections. That's what we have now. Our elections are too much run by too much money. It wasn't that way always, so we should go back.
Thank you. The next question is regarding cancer, Dr. Campbell. I know you spoke about it quite a bit in your presentation, but for cancer patients with advanced cachexia that need high intake of proteins, the amount of plant-based proteins to minimize the cachexia is much higher and much more difficult to intake as opposed to whey protein. How do you suggest to administer high plant-based protein to cancer patients that have difficulty eating? Is there any data on the effect of plant-based nutrition on stage 3 and stage 4 cancer?
Boy, I'm really out of school on this. I thought a lot about that, to be honest about it. But quite frankly, the situation is in my field, and both on the medical side as well as the research side, we've never really fully embraced the idea that plant-based foods are the ideal kind of food for starters. And so now we know that it can reverse heart disease, chronic degenerative disease of other kinds. You know, it's really good. And I really believe our studies, for example, in our lab, when we were doing that, we experimentally, we could reverse cancer and that sort of thing. It comes back to your question about cachexia and what cancer patients can do in that particular state. My guess is, I have to say, it's my guess, it's my best evidence, best hypothesis without knowing the evidence, because we are not allowed to do that kind of research, essentially, is to just eat, you know, go to the whole food plant-based diet, low in oil, don't use the added oil, low in added sugar, quite frankly, but make it tasty, and just try to get on to eating that kind of food. I think eventually that's good. My son is now doing a study. He's a physician. He's now, as I say, on the faculty of a university medical center. He's doing a study now with women with advanced breast cancer, stage 4 breast cancer. And he's already got that underway. It got intercepted a little bit with this corona problem during this past year. But he's almost the first one that I know of to ever try this. And so far his results, I don't want to get ahead of myself on this, but so far it looks okay, it looks good. I'm impressed.
Thank you. I just wanted to get clarification on a previous question. Just to be clear about the vitamin D, have you heard or can you confirm whether or not vitamin D is still good to help with COVID immunity?
No, I have no evidence of that.
Very good. Thank you. Next question, is honey okay?
Yeah, I know that's for ethical reasons that's avoided. But I don't see really anything scientifically, and I'd like to rely on science.
Okay. All right.
I don't have any evidence that's harmful. No, okay. It's okay.
Very good. Does your COVID hypothesis cover why some young, healthy adults are being afflicted with significant COVID problems?
I don't know. You know, in the youngsters, we are having more and more young people being obese, quite obese, in fact, compared to what it was 30, 40 years ago. And so young people, unfortunately, their health is being compromised and just during my lifetime. And so those who are really overweight problems, I'm sure they have other problems too. They're really on the way to actually creating at least the fertile ground for getting diabetes, for one thing, let alone, you know, maybe heart disease a little bit later on. So younger children who are already unhealthy and as shown up by, let's say, excessive weight, obesity. Yeah, they're going to be more susceptible to this.
Thank you. And two final questions here, Dr. Campbell. These will be the two final questions for this evening, guys. Again, it sounds like we want clarification on the vitamin D. Is there any harm in taking the vitamin D supplementation if you don't have access to regular sunlight?
Not particularly, no. There's some recommendations of that. I can't say that I know of any evidence, again, that causes harm.
Okay. And final question here. How will you be protected from the flu or COVID virus if you are exposed to it if you don't take the vaccine?
I eat the right food. Pretty simple.
Yes, it's as simple as that.
Yeah.
All right. I think we have a final comment from Paul.
Yes, you know, because this has been a real science talk, and you know, it's like for me, just somebody who's very average, I have to really concentrate. So I always go to like silly to kind of just mellow me out and square me up. So I picked a person or two people's name, and you know how at sporting events they have the you know, what do they call it, the kiss-thon, or you know, the kiss camera. So I picked out Ann and Don Reinhard. Ann and Don, would you give everybody just a kiss, the two of you, please? No, each other, you guys, please. That's so beautiful. And that's how it should be. You know, part of this thing is love. So if I could, Lisa, Colin, I got goosebumps. I'm going to show it to him really close. You see, because I love you. And I love the fact that you shared this information. His book has just come out. Colin, if there's a way you could send us a link, we'd love to put it on our website so people can go to our website and get your book. But everybody, he is a true national treasure. He is somebody so dear to me. And let's all just give him, in fact, everyone on mic for a moment. He deserves the biggest standing ovation. Yep, that's right. Standing up. If you were there, we'd be standing. Thank you. Love you, Colin. Colin, you stay healthy.
Yes.
Lisa, you can wrap it up from here. I appreciate everybody.